Once upon a dream, O fool, I shall go mad. He marched forward, a serious look on his face, holding his staff high and his rock firmly. He wasn't like this in real life, Philip whispered as they set off after him. Aurora Rose gave him a look. All right, maybe a little, but a lot of it was for show. Underneath he was a stern, solid ruler, big drinker, big eater, and a very good friend to those who were good friends to him. But if it came to executing criminals of the realm, he had no problem taking his sword and doing it himself. She shuddered. Though she wasn't sure if it was for the Hubert of the past or the Hubert of the present, Philip was speaking about him like he was already gone. They followed him on what seemed at first to be a random meander through the trees, completely at odds with where they had been walking before. Hubert strode like a proper king, as if his robes were still long and thick and trailing behind him, but he also kept a watchful eye on everything around him. Shadows, the world above, the distant movements. He wasn't nervous, precisely, just aware. It also looked like he occasionally waved to certain trees and rocks. The princess decided not to call him out on it. From the way he almost saluted one large boulder, it was obvious that whether or not he actually had discourse with the landscape, he definitely recognized it. And Aurora Rose, broken and beaten up, grieving and wounded, was just relieved to let someone else take the lead for a while. It took all of her concentration just to keep up with the father and son, swinging her stiff and injured left leg into place with every stride. Her side hurt when she breathed. It was a strange pain that felt wrong, like bones were doing something they shouldn't. She wondered if they would have what they would have done if Hubert hadn't come along, if the fairies hadn't figured out how to send him. For the first time in the journey, Philip walked ahead forever, keeping pace with his father. They didn't talk about anything serious, they just exchanged the occasional strange, manly platitudes that seemed out of keeping with the present situation. Philip would remark on the weather, and his father would guffaw and tell a story about a terrible downpour during which he had hidden in a small cave, along with two foxes and a badger. Aurora Rose wondered if she had made that rain. She wondered if it reflected something else that had gone on in her head. Eventually Philip seemed to remember the princess and dropped back to be with her. "You're doing all right?" he asked. "Not great, but all right," she admitted. "We're almost there," he assured her. They wandered down the path, not quite touching, not quite bumping shoulders. The sun must have climbed high above the trees. Time passed, and light shifted, filtered though it was. "My lady," King Hubert said. He swept his hand forward dramatically and bowed. There, staring in the middle of nowhere, was a path of neat little mossy flagstones that led into the darkness of the forest. Her heart began pumping. The path didn't look familiar, exactly, but she was overwhelmed with nostalgia, which was strange when she thought about it. In the real world, where she was less than a day away from her home in the forest, and less than a day had passed since she had left it, and in this world she had never been there at all, but she felt oddly tall, huge really, as if she was coming back to some place she hadn't seen since she was a small child. She started to run down the path, but Philip grabbed her hand and held her back. "Doesn't this look familiar to you?" she whispered. "It looks very much like the area where we met," Philip said guardedly, "but not exactly. The trees and the plants are the same, but the rocks!" she cried in delight, seeing a giant gray boulder with sides so tall and strange it was like a small mountain with sheer cliffs. This time she did try to run and was rewarded by stumbling over her bad leg and experiencing a painful tear in her belly. She bent over, hand on her waist. Philip and Hubert looked at her with worry. "Are you all right?" No, she realized. Her body wasn't up to much more adventuring, but she shook her head, put up her hand. She was fine. "Let's just continue on," she suggested. Then there was a crackle in the underbrush behind them, where they had come from. It wasn't loud and it wasn't heavy. It was, however, extremely ominous. "I thought none of Maleficent's demons could make it here," Philip said warily. "Here in the deepest parts of Rose's mind." "That wasn't a bear," Hubert pointed out. "I know from bears." "The little girl back there wasn't a demon," the princess said wearily, "and she could just be, waiting for us to come back out. We can't hide in the deepest part of my mind forever." There was another, very tiny shuffle of leaves, and the sound of air sucking in from someplace else. A very unnatural "humph." "Called upon again," Hubert said enthusiastically in response, straightening his robes. "I'll deal with the demon. You two go on. Finish your adventure." What? Philip cried. No, we should all stick together, father. No, lad, the old man said with a sad smile. This is my part of the story. Yours lies ahead. He's right, Philip, Aurora Rose said gently. It's the best plan. Maybe he can delay whatever's out there until we can get done whatever we need to. Listen to her, my boy. She's a smart one. Philip looked back and forth between them desperately for a moment. Then she set his jaw and nodded. All right. Thank you, father. We would have never found it without you, he said, embracing the old man warmly. We will see you on the other side, the princess said gratefully, when we all wake up. Hubert gave her a funny look. The peasant is the princess, eh? I don't think you're either, young lady. I don't know what you are. Maybe you don't either, but I don't think you'll see me on the other side. Exactly the same way, I mean. What do you mean? Philip asked, trying to keep his voice calm. What I'm trying to say is, well, the king flustered and fought her words. Son, I've been lost in these woods for years now. I've had some absolutely top-notch adventures, and some made quite a few furry friends, but put some dreadful demons out of its misery. But I don't think all this has been entirely found. Do you understand? No, Philip said with a weary look. Ah, well, Hubert clapped him on the shoulder. Don't worry about it now. You have bigger issues to deal with. Kingdoms to save, princesses too, well, I don't know. We'll talk later. I wish we could have talked before. Really, talked. His remaining eye grew glassy. Then he raised his branch in a kingly salute. I shall defeat anything that would attack you and hinder you in your glorious quest, and when I have persevered, I shall make my way back to that infernal vine-covered castle. You may have further need of my aid later on dealing with that witch. And honestly, I should have been there when she gets her what's what. He gave one last smile. Then he turned with great slow dignity and headed back to the shadows of the forest. He had disappeared, like a wild animal in 30 paces. Philip watched him go. Emotion struggled for dominance in his face. What just happened? He asked in a strangled voice. Something just happened. I feel like we just said goodbye somehow. Aurora Rose put a hand on his arm. Her first urge was to touch him since their fight, but she wasn't thinking of an us or a we or a him. She only saw Philip, the boy who had been upbeat and brave and inspiring on this journey, brought to the edge of tears. He looked down at her hand. The movement dislodged a single drop, which flew to the ground, dampening a salty spot in the leaves. Then he shook himself and patted her hand. Let's go, he whispered. She nodded. She could almost ignore the little pains all over her body, lost in the satisfaction she felt from her surroundings. Familiar oak leaves crunched on the ground, tracing their strange shapes in pale dirt, looking like harmless baby monsters. The smells they made as she crushed them were so heady she wanted to swim in the air. It was fall here, she suddenly realized, while it had been other seasons somewhere elsewhere in the dream world. Fall was her favorite after spring. Small, burnished brown acorns with their cute tan caps littered the ground. She used to collect them, and it was difficult to stay present. Her consciousness had to be constantly and reluctantly pulled back to the world around her. Every part of her wanted to sneak into the memories. The warm ocean of completeness she knew was there now, easily dipped into. Come on, the prince said, giving her his arm to lean on. This time she took it right away. She spotted the cottage first. It's sort of like the place I was kidnapped from, Philip said. It was a pleasant little shack, wood and thatched roof. Funny little rooms added in higgledy-piggledy, and one small chimney reaching up crooked. Above all, little puffs of smoke came out. But it wasn't quite right. She was pretty sure the stones had been normal stone colors, not bright, shiny browns and whites and blacks, like a picture painted by a child. And there hadn't been a flower garden on the roof, sweet peas dangling over the sides in front of a window. But it was close enough, she decided. It was a woman waiting in front of the door, which somehow neither of them noticed at first. A simple dark green dress and a lighter green apron fell in clean, crisp folds over her body. A pair of thick graying braids hung from the sides of their head, behind her ears. Her face was smooth and for a deep few wrinkles. She seemed inclined toward peace and kindness. come in, children," she urged them. "Quickly now." "It's another trap," Philip said uncertainly, but even he could feel it was different somehow. "I know her?" the princess said, confused but intrigued. "No, this is all right, Philip. This cottage is the safest place in your mind, Aurora Rose." The girl jumped at her full name, he had begun to think of it as her proper name. "Please hurry," the woman urged them. The princess looked at Philip in the eye, and for once she was reassuring him. He accepted her near motionless nod, and the two stepped forward.